and Refugee Affairs. What now, what next? We will be joined tonight by Mnsure Rivera, the Director of the City's Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs. The Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs was created in 2018, the first such office in the state. It provides guidance on immigration and refugee issues to elected leaders, policymakers, and city staff, and works to ensure that Minneapolis is a safe and welcoming place for all to come. Director Rivera will walk us through the work of the OIRA. We're also joined by Sarah Brenes, an attorney with Advocates for Human Rights. This organization is one of several that partners with the city to provide legal services to our immigrant and refugee neighbors. Sarah's also a Ward 1 resident. She'll tell us more about the work of the Advocates for Human Rights. Our guest will also be discussing many changes to the immigration and refugee policy that are occurring at the federal level with our new administration, and the impact of those changes could have for our city and our state. I will just ask the participants to introduce themselves and engage with what you have to share.
Super. Thank you so much, Councilmember Reich. I'm very happy and grateful to be able to present this evening. Again, my name is Mnsure Rivera, the Director of the Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs for the City of Minneapolis. The acronym for our office is OIRA. For people who are interested in getting more information about the office than what I'm going to be sharing this evening, please feel free to check out our website. If you type into any search engine, OIRA, O-I-R-A, Minneapolis, the webpage will pop up with a good deal of information about the work of the office. So just a very little bit of information about me and my background. I was an immigration attorney for about 18 years before I started working for the city of Minneapolis. I am also the daughter of immigrants to the United States. My father is from Colombia, and my mom is from Italy. And so it is such an honor for me to be someone who helps welcome immigrant, refugees, and new Americans to the city of Minneapolis because of my own personal background as a daughter of immigrants. So very briefly, an overview of the work of the Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs. As Councilmember Reich indicated, the office began operations in 2018, in July 2018 to be exact. It is a one-person office located within the Department of Neighborhood and Community Relations. And really the principal objectives of the office include to ensure that our community members, our elected officials, and city staff are aware of immigration developments both at the federal level and developments that impact immigrant, refugee, and new American communities. And I assist city leaders in developing policies, practices, and procedures that support these same community members with a goal towards policies that advance immigrant, refugee, and new American inclusion efforts. One of these that the city began supporting in 2017, I believe, was a relationship that was initiated between the city of Minneapolis and immigration legal service providers, including the Advocates for Human Rights, of which Sarah Brenes, our fellow speaker tonight, is an attorney with that organization. So these relationships with the Advocates, with Immigrant Law Center of Minnesota, with Volunteer Lawyers Network, and most recently this year with Mid-Minnesota Legal Aid, assists the city in ensuring that people have access to accurate information and legal representation, including full representation in immigration court proceedings, regardless of ability to pay, with an eye towards ensuring that our City of Minneapolis residents achieve immigration stability and also are able to avoid deportation from the United States. So those relationships have been so valuable, particularly since the advent of COVID, where our partnerships have resulted in a number of in-person and virtual information sessions. You know, there have been so many developments in the immigration landscape, both in the last 4 years of the previous administration and already just in the first month of the current administration, that our relationships really allow us to ensure that we're communicating information out to communities. Another objective of the office, and maybe I'll just stop there and turn it over to Sarah, is to identify occasions where we can celebrate, recognize, and elevate the importance of our immigrant, refugee, and new American communities here in the city of Minneapolis. Our foreign-born population is approximately 15% of the population of the residents of the city. So a bit more than 65,000, estimated 65,000 individuals who reside in the city of Minneapolis who were born outside of the United States. And there are many opportunities to recognize our different cultural communities. And part of the work of the office is to identify those occasions, whether it be World Refugee Day in June, International Migrants Day in December, and not only celebrate, but also use those occasions as calls to action for immigrant advocacy and for support of inclusion efforts for our various communities. So I'll pause there and turn it over to Sarah.
Thanks so much, Michelle. As Michelle mentioned, I am an attorney, immigration attorney that works at the Advocates for Human Rights. We're based in Minneapolis, but serve individuals throughout the state, as well as our neighbors in the Dakotas with our direct legal services. But we're a unique human rights organization because we provide direct legal services, which is the part of our work that I oversee, but we also do other human rights advocacy, both at the local level, state level, national level, and the international level. We have a special consultative status at the United Nations. And so we weave a lot of the work that we do in advocacy and direct services from having our advocacy on issues such as human trafficking inform how we're working with individuals who are human trafficking survivors, and then having former clients who we've served providing legal services for them to seek asylum, have an opportunity to have their voices be heard in the international venues that look at human rights issues. So, for example, bringing clients to the United Nations or having them contribute to reports where countries are being reviewed for their human rights records that oftentimes generate the need for people to find safety in places like the United States. We've been around for close to 40 years now and have a lot of different areas of our work. As I mentioned, my focus is our direct legal services program. So all of our work connects to the Universal Declaration for Human Rights and engages volunteer attorneys. So most of the work that I do is to serve asylum seekers, human trafficking survivors, unaccompanied children, detained immigrants, and pair them with volunteer attorneys that we train. Most of the volunteers that we work with don't work in the area of immigration, but we train them in these discrete areas of law to provide pro bono representation. So each year, our volunteers donate close to $7 million in their legal services to serve about over 800 clients that we have currently now who are going through the immigration process. And then, as I mentioned, we also integrate our work doing observation of human rights. So, for example, we have a court observation project where we have volunteers who aren't attorneys necessarily that are in the immigration courtrooms and observing hearings for individuals who are detained in immigration custody and are going through removal proceedings. We just came out with a report earlier this year, and there's actually will be an event next week. I can share a link to that where we'll talk a little bit about the observations that we've had and some of the recommendations that have come out of that for our immigration court system, so that people have a fair day in court in the immigration realm. We also have a program called Watch that has individual observers in some of our county courts observing domestic violence hearings. So that's opportunities for the general public to be involved in human rights work without any special training in law, because our goal is to engage as many people as possible in the human rights movement and to also provide assistance to individuals who are seeking protection and safety here in the U.S. Oh, you're muted, Michelle. Uh-oh.
Sorry.
There we go.
Sorry. So we've got a lot of ground to cover, and it's exciting and fast paced, but also quite voluminous. So I'm going to try and hit the high notes, and we'll switch back and forth if that's okay with everybody, so that there's a little bit of a break between what we're going to share. So we'll start out with the executive orders and memoranda and presidential proclamations, and then move into legislation. So I'll start with a few and then turn it over to Sarah. There have been a number of executive orders, memoranda, and proclamations addressing immigration-related issues. Some have immediate impact, and some are more kind of aspirational and require a significant amount of additional work. So I'm just going to hit the ones that first have a clear immediate impact and I think are easier to grasp, and then maybe we'll go into some of the more challenging ones. So first is the census. There was an executive order on the census that was issued on January 20th that clearly states that everybody counts regardless of what their immigration status is. So that represents a clear break from the previous administration, which had tried to exclude individuals from census reapportionment based on undocumented status in the United States. Another very clear policy shift that has immediate impacts is the rescission of the travel ban. If people will recall, at the very beginning of the last administration, within the first month or so, there was a travel ban that was instituted impacting individuals from primarily Muslim countries, and then there was a second ban that impacted individuals from some African countries, mostly African countries. Those bans were rescinded. Again, this was an initial action of the Biden administration. And so one important takeaway is that individuals who are barred from coming into the United States because of those bans, there's a clear instruction that the Department of State should revisit the visa denials for those individuals and reconsider whether those individuals should be allowed to enter the United States. So those are a couple of immediate impacts. And with regard to the travel ban, just so people may not remember what countries were impacted. So individuals from Burma, Eritrea, Iran, Kyrgyzstan, Libya, Nigeria, North Korea, Somalia, Sudan, Syria, Tanzania, Venezuela, and Yemen. Those were the countries that were impacted by the travel ban. One interesting item of note is that a couple of additional bans that were implemented earlier in 2020, impacting individuals, I believe, in employment-based categories and some family-based categories as well, have just been rescinded. Like, that is breaking news. I think that came out either earlier today or just a little bit earlier this week. So those are a couple of, I guess, more easy to digest. Another that is worth talking about is a memorandum imposing a regulatory freeze. And that concept, the reason why that is important is that throughout the previous administration, the federal government had been implementing many actions changing immigration policy, not by law, but by regulation. And the pace of the regulatory actions was always fast, but in the last 6 months of the previous administration had really reached a breakneck speed, where the comment period was only 30 days, so if you were questioning whether a regulation was valid or not, or what impact it would have on community, there's a very limited amount of time to comment. So this regulatory freeze, this memorandum, halts action on regulations that have not been published, regulations that were in the review process for publication. So the new administration can review them and identify whether they would want those regulations to be published. And as I'm indicating, many of the regulations that were advanced at the tail end of the last administration had an impact, would have had a negative impact on immigrant, refugee, and new American communities. And so it is worthwhile and helpful to have that regulatory freeze. So a few other initial executive orders that I'll touch on. One is relating to immigrant integration and inclusion. The full title of the executive order is Order on Restoring Faith in Our Legal Immigration System and Strengthening Integration and Inclusion Efforts for New Americans. This one was signed on February 2nd and establishes a task force on new Americans with a goal towards advancing immigrant inclusion initiatives, encouraging individuals to apply for U.S. citizenship status. It also orders a review of existing policies and regulations and guidance to identify whether there are barriers to acquisition of immigration citizenship within our procedures that can be eliminated. And a couple of things that are really worth noting here is that the previous administration had tried to implement a significant fee increase, increasing filing fees for various immigration applications. And this executive order specifically points to the need to review actions such as fee increase as a potential barrier to acquisition of immigration status. Also within this executive order is an initiative to develop a plan to eliminate barriers to acquisition of U.S. citizenship. And I think one interesting thing to note is following this executive order, the administration has already taken steps to revert back to an earlier version of the citizenship test. A newer, more difficult citizenship test had been put into effect in December of 2020. And so I think it's very interesting that, following this executive order, the federal administration has now indicated that we'll revert back to an earlier version of the citizenship test, as many had criticized the new test as being significantly more difficult and creating an unnecessary barrier to acquisition of citizenship. A couple of other actions worth noting: deferred action for childhood arrivals, a memorandum preserving and fortifying DACA. So this really was more an aspirational memorandum. I think it's important for people to be aware of the fact that even starting in December of 2020, new deferred action for childhood arrivals applications could be filed, but still it's very helpful to see that the Biden administration strongly supports deferred action for childhood arrivals. And maybe, Sarah, maybe I'll just kick it over to you and then take it back for a few other ones, just so that we've got a little bit of a break.
Sure. Thanks, Michelle. So the ones that I'll highlight are ones that are related a lot to our work with asylum seekers. There were one of the immediate actions was stopping building of the border wall. We'll talk about the new legislation that was proposed that includes some enhanced technology and things of that nature to provide more monitoring of smuggling and trafficking issues, but stopping the actual physical construction of a border wall. That was one of the executive orders that came out. Another one focusing on setting up a task force to address the over 500 children that remain separated from families due to the executive order, and the policy of separating children from their parents when they were arriving at the southern border. There is another executive order that addressed at the end of last year, there were many people that were waiting in Mexico to have a turn to be able to have their asylum claims heard at the border. And so it's suspending that process where hearings were run down at the border and allowing people to be screened and then proceed with their asylum claims in the interior after seeing just a lot of poor conditions and dangerous conditions for individuals that were having to wait on the other side to have their asylum claims heard. There's also moving the cap for refugees. Asylum seekers are individuals who are going through the legal process to essentially be recognized as refugees once they're here in the United States. So anyone who's in the US or arriving at the border or the airport could apply for asylum status. And there's no cap on how many people can receive asylum each year. For refugees, that's a number that's set by the president each year. So for the fiscal year that would starts in October in the federal fiscal year, the president would set the number of refugees that the U.S. would be willing to resettle here. So people that have gone through the process and would be able to arrive as refugees, work with our refugee resettlement agencies, and are able to access benefits and employment that refugees are entitled to when they arrive. So that had been at 15,000 under the previous administration. It will move up to 125,000 individuals that would be allowed to come in as refugees, and will create a more robust resettlement program again. There were also changes to enforcement priorities. Under the previous administration, it was a very, very broad net and really created a lot of anxiety and really paralyzing fear for individuals, because it basically just had anyone and everyone apprehended. Now there'll be priorities again in order to focus enforcement actions on priorities that the Immigration Customs Enforcement has, and not just anyone that they might encounter during other actions that they carry out. And then finally, there was a memo that looked to have a 100-day suspension on deportations. That one has been essentially stopped from being implemented due to some litigation in court. So removals are occurring, but I guess I'll say from our experience here in Minnesota, the number of individuals that are being removed in detention, people being detained, the numbers are much lower than they were about a year ago, largely due to COVID and then other issues just related to COVID in terms of deportations being carried out.
Yep, and I think from the standpoint of deportations, I think it's worth mentioning that while there is a lot of eagerness around some of these initial executive or some of these initial federal level actions, deportations are continuing to occur, and you know, what Sarah was alluding to, the 100-day halt on deportations, and the fact that that memorandum is subject to litigation in Texas. There is an indefinite pause on the implementation of that memorandum. One thing to keep in mind is while we have these very exciting developments in the immigration landscape, deportations continue to occur, and so advocacy is still necessary in this area. There are a number of legal service organizations, including the advocates that represent individuals who are in immigration court proceedings. In addition to legal service organizations, there are many community-based advocacy organizations. You know, a couple I just named right off the bat would include Release Minnesota 8, which does a lot of work within the Southeast Asian community, Unidos Minnesota, which does a lot of work in the Latinx community, Black Immigrant Collective, which has done an incredible amount of advocacy on behalf of Black immigrants. And it's just an area where it is worthwhile to kind of keep your eye on the ball, because it does take a lot of energy to ensure that our government is meeting its highest ideals, you know, and it's wonderful that the federal government has taken the initiative from the very first day of the administration, but there's still quite a lot of work to do for us to get to the point where individuals are no longer unnecessarily being removed from the United States. And if I could just mention one more memorandum, and then maybe we can turn to legislation that is pending at the federal level. There was a memorandum condemning and combating racism, xenophobia, and intolerance against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in the United States. And this memorandum acknowledges the federal government's role in furthering xenophobic sentiments against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders and members of those communities, condemns and combats racism, xenophobia, and intolerance against the AAPI community, and also commits the Attorney General to exploring opportunities to support efforts of state and local agencies and AAPI communities and community-based organizations to prevent acts of racism and hatred against members of the AAPI community. So, like, in sum, with regard to these policy developments, again, I'll mention that the Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs, OIRA Minneapolis, does have immigration updates, including a list with links to these different actions in the event that you would want to read them. It's exciting to see that there are opportunities for a partnership from federal to state to local in some of these initiatives. And so if this is an area of interest to you, invite you to please reach out to the Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs for more information regarding how you can be more involved in immigrant advocacy. And maybe if it's okay, Sarah, to turn it over and start talking about the US Citizenship Act, which is quite a read. I had it next to me in another meeting, and it's pretty thick.
Yeah. Yeah. So the U.S. Citizenship Act of 2021 is several hundred pages long, so we'll cover some of the highlights. I think one of the really symbolic but significant changes it's proposing is under our current immigration law, it uses the term alien to talk about non-citizens. And so it's officially changing the terminology in reference to individuals who are not citizens here in the US. And so that's one of the significant changes that will hopefully go a long way. Significantly, it's creating a roadmap to citizenship for undocumented individuals. There's a faster track for dreamers, so children who were brought here but are continue to be undocumented, those that have temporary protected status. Some farm workers have an expedited path, and then other individuals that were here without a legal status in January of this year would have an 8-year path, would have background checks and establish that they could pay taxes, but would create a path for people to regularize their status here. There are also reforms for our current immigration system is really pillared on family-based immigration, but many of those paths have very, very long waits. So there's efforts to both provide more opportunity for individuals who have petitions that have been granted to create a path for them to obtain status through family members. It also eliminates discriminating based on individuals' LGBTQ status and providing more paths for those families, as well as some of the other categories of individuals that there just wasn't a path for them, though logically there should be under our current immigration laws. There's some changes related to our employment-based immigration system to really help the economy and create more opportunities for people to work here in the U.S. And then there's a number of initiatives that support integration initiatives, and that's something where there'll be a lot of opportunity for state and local government to be involved in non-governmental organizations, community organizations that really focus on providing English language assistance, inclusion programs, and other things to really welcome immigrants into our communities. There's also other provisions that strengthen laws that will prevent and address exploitation. Undocumented immigrants have a higher level of vulnerability to be exploited by employers, so it creates some strengthened systems there in order to address violations and create prevention there. And then it also strengthens some of our other humanitarian relief, such as for asylum seekers. There's currently a 1-year filing deadline for individuals who are seeking asylum, so it would propose to eliminate that. We're unique in the world in that we have that requirement. It also raises the cap for U visas, which are for individuals who've been victims of serious crimes. Typically, right now there's a cap of 10,000 visas that are granted at a national level each year. And day one of the fiscal year, that cap is reached. So it's about a 10-year wait for someone to actually be able to benefit from that visa, which is one that's created that encourages non-citizens to report crimes and work in collaboration with law enforcement to address crimes and see law enforcement as partners in that. And we'll also hopefully have some time to talk a little bit about some of the legislation at a state level that's actually related to U visas. And then additional allotments for T visas, which are for survivors of human trafficking and applicants under the Violence Against Women Act. There's a number of other provisions that look to address some of the root causes of migration, a lot having to do with Central America, which for the last several years we've seen a significant uptick in the number of people fleeing that region due to very complex violent situations. So the Act will also encourage some cooperation, collaboration with those governments to try to understand and reduce the push factors in migration in that region in particular, and then also try to improve our immigration courts. Currently, our local immigration court in Minnesota, its docket between increased cases, not enough funding, and COVID, their docket has tripled in the last few years. So people are really waiting years and years to have a day in court. And so there's some proposals there to increase some funding, as well as more opportunities for individuals to have representation. For example, children are not, there's no right to counsel. They're not provided attorneys in immigration court, which is something that we've seen a lot in the news as we've seen children and families going through the immigration court process. Those are a few of the highlights. I'm sure I missed a lot of things from the proposal. So I don't know if there's others that you wanted to add, Michelle, or if we want to talk about.
You know, I wonder, I know we've got a small group here, and if there are questions, I know that was a lot of material to cover in an extremely short period of time. So maybe just give it a second in the event that people have questions or have information that they'd like to share before transitioning to state and local, because there's a lot going on at the state level, and we'll just provide like a quickie high level overview of that too. But just want to pause so people can take a breath. And if there are questions on what we addressed so far, happy to answer them.
Lisa or Ryan, are we seeing any questions?
I actually have a question.
Mm.
I'm just going to jump right in there because we're a small group. You talked about some change in asylum seeker policies. Have there been any changes to? I feel that there's probably a set list of reasons that make you eligible to seek asylum. And has there been any change in those categories or no?
So some of them are caught up. So there were some proposals. There was a big regulation that came out late last year that proposed to make a lot of substantive changes to asylum eligibility. Some of the regulations have gotten caught in the freeze. Others are in court litigation right now. But the crux of what elements people have to meet in order to receive asylum remain the same. So someone has to fear persecution based on their race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or their political opinion. So it remains designed mostly focused on individual fears, something related to a characteristic that someone has, and that piece hasn't changed. The last administration was there's been over a decade of both actions by the Attorney General and our immigration courts and our circuit courts that have addressed issues related to domestic violence, as well as some of the gang-based violence. And a lot of those are the cases that are coming out of Central America, and really sort of understanding how the context in which people are fleeing, and understanding that there's a backdrop to the reasons that people are fleeing that are oftentimes related to grounds of asylum, rather than having a reaction of not acknowledging the state as, broad state government role in their ability or willingness to protect people, or to actually perpetuate some of the violence that people are fleeing. But most of the regulations that have been proposed, and I don't believe in this new proposal, new legislation has anything that directly relates to the substantive grounds for asylum. It's more related to the time period in which someone can go through the process, and more related to the procedure in which someone would access the system.
Thank you.
In regards, I have one as well, actually. In regards to asylum seekers, building off of Lisa's question, in particular on the U.S.-Mexico border, in the first month and a half here of the new administration, are we seeing a better treatment of asylum seekers across the border? In terms of some of the more human rights violations that we were seeing with the previous administration. I just heard a headline today, or saw it, that a new detainment facility was opened up. I don't know what the end to that is, but anyways, just any knowledge on that would be helpful, I think, as well.
Yeah, I think everyone agreed, particularly with the process of having people wait in Mexico. I think everyone acknowledged that it wasn't going to change overnight, that they needed to create systems in order to allow people to be processed fairly. I think the last, the challenge predates the previous administration. The Obama administration set up facilities to hold women and children. And so I think that we're hopeful that there'll be some changes, and there will be a process for people to be screened efficiently and effectively, and not have to be in detention facilities in order to seek protection. I think there's a lot of broader discussions about immigration detention in general, and sort of the broader private prison issue, and just detaining people who are, immigration is civil administrative law, and separate and apart from our criminal law, yet at least in Minnesota here, we have the immigration system contracts with our county jails in order to hold immigrants in custody when that is justified in their eyes. And then, there's facilities that are run by immigration, there's private prisons, there's county jails that are all part of this system. And so I think there's complex layers, and then there's individual actors too that are doing the processing, and the different layers of government, and people really sort of figuring out who's accountable and how do you hold people accountable at all levels of it. But at least from our agency, it's a little early to see. We do see a lot of people that are released from the border and then make their way to Minnesota and continue with the process of seeking asylum. But we've yet to see too many people that have come in yet this year, and seeing if there's a significant change.
I think one thing that does seem clear is that, and Sarah, you can confirm whether you agree that this is true, that the MPP program, the pretty inaptly named Migrant Protection program that is more commonly known as the Remain in Mexico program, whereby asylum seekers could not actually physically enter the United States but had to remain in Mexico, that the current administration seems to be taking a clear step away from that policy and returning to a system where individuals are permitted to actually enter the United States. And then step 2 of that is, do those individuals remain in detention or are they released to family? Not quite sure exactly how that is proceeding, but at least the MPP program, it does appear that that policy is being rescinded.
Phased out. Yeah.
That in practice. Yep.
Thank you.
So if there aren't more questions, perhaps we can like quick transition to what's happening on the state level and give some quickie updates on bills and bill numbers that are worth watching. It's very exciting, you know, as a City of Minneapolis employee, it's so exciting to see policy developments at the municipal level that really do have an impact on immigrant, refugee, and new American communities. Often, you know, often the sort of layperson's view is, well, if it has to do with immigration, it's federal, right? It's federal legislation and that's it. When in reality, there are so many things that we can do on a local and statewide level that have a significant impact on our immigrant, refugee, and new American communities. So we'll just go through a couple of them. One is a driver's license bill. Since the early 2000s, individuals who are in the United States who don't have valid immigration status are not able to acquire a state driver's license or a state ID. There have been multiple initiatives at the state level to try to expand access to a driver's license and state ID to enable individuals who don't have authorization to qualify. Those efforts year after year have been unsuccessful. There's a new bill this year that was introduced into the House. It's House File 1163. And again, this bill would enable individuals to obtain a driver's license or a state ID regardless of immigration status. And interestingly, there's actually going to be a hearing on this bill tomorrow. So if you log into the state legislature website and look up House File 1163, you can watch the hearing yourself. So exciting viewing. You know, one thing that's really meaningful about driver's licenses is particularly since the advent of COVID and the impact of the pandemic on people's ability to actually get around and use public transportation. I know that as more people are vaccinated and sort of a sense of more normalcy returns, that may impact people's use of public transportation. But really, you know, in the spring and in the summer and, you know, even through fall, like an inability to drive yourself around because you don't have a driver's license truly does have a significant impact on many facets of a person's life. So do think that's an important measure to keep an eye out for. And Sarah, I know that you wanted to mention at least one or two measures too. I'm not sure if it was Mnsure that you wanted to cover. Can you handle that one?
Yeah, that one is, so essentially the Mnsure eligibility currently requires some documentation, and either you have legal immigration status or you're applying. So for example, for asylum seekers, if you're a child under the age of 14, you can apply for Mnsure once you have your receipt showing you've applied for asylum. If you're over 18, you have to have your receipt and you also have to have work authorization. So there's a gap of people between 14 and 18, and further complicating those individuals is there was a regulation that changed the waiting period to get a work permit from 6 months to an entire year. And so I think it's an example of, and I think this goes for the driver's license as well, kind of it's important for states to understand immigration status, but oftentimes it's very complex. Like when you look at the instructions that are given to state officials to try to decipher the immigration paperwork, a lot of that is really outdated. And just on a public safety and public health level, having our residents have access to driver's license is important, and having them have an opportunity to apply for the public health insurance is also critical to the health of our communities. And then the other one, oh, go ahead.
Oh, yes, I was just going to say, like, maybe I can swoop in for the U visa.
Sure.
So there, perhaps people who are watching this presentation are familiar with the UNT visa ordinance in the city of Minneapolis. U visas are for individuals who are crime victims. It enables a person who's a crime victim, who's assisted in the investigation or prosecution of the offense that was committed against them, to be able to file an application to obtain immigration status in the United States. The city of Minneapolis has a U visa ordinance which designates a set time frame by which our law enforcement entities that include the Minneapolis Police Department, the City Attorney's Office, and the Civil Rights Department, gives a set period of time by which those offices need to make a decision on whether to sign a U certification, which is a first step in getting a U visa. At present, there is no similar requirement at the state level, but there is a bill that is currently at the state legislature which would create such a requirement for law enforcement entities within a set period of time to make a decision on whether to sign a U certification that is presented to them. And I don't have the bill number on that right in front of me, but I know that that is in process.
Is that the HR 321?
I think so. Let's see. Yep, HF 321. Yes. So, yeah, that's the rundown of measures that the state legislature, some of the ones that we're tracking anyway. And so I'm wondering, maybe, Sarah, if you don't mind, like for the last few minutes or so, kind of going through, I know that you talked about this a little bit at the outset, but would you mind talking just a little bit more about the Court Observation Project, Asylum Support Network, just some additional information of ways that people can get involved if they're interested in immigration and immigrant advocacy through the advocates?
Sure, yeah, and I just put a link to our website, as well as a link to the event that we are hosting next week on March 4th, that will go over the report that we recently came out with, and there's links to the report in there as well. So as Michelle mentioned, we have a court observation program that individuals who are interested in learning how to do human rights documentation and observation are trained and then go into the immigration court and basically keep a log of their observations of the hearings. And it's really important, as I mentioned, individuals, there are no public defenders in immigration court, so a lot of times people are representing themselves. And so having the public eyes and ears in the courtroom helps hold our immigration courts and judges and the government attorneys accountable in order to have documentation of how people are being treated and how they're understanding the system and going through the system. So I have some information there about that. The other project that we work on in collaboration with the International Association for Refugees, we co-facilitate a asylum support network. And essentially, this came out of a lot of individuals who are interested in assisting refugees when we saw the huge refugee wave in Europe, and then we started to see more Central American asylum seekers. And so basically it brings together individuals and groups who are in faith communities, in community organizations, or in some way want to be involved in supporting asylum seekers in different ways, mostly other than providing legal services. But we work with people who provide accompaniment and basically helping them navigate life here in the U.S. Our clients we're helping them go through the process of being legally welcomed and able to stay here in the U.S., but that doesn't mean that the community in which they live cannot welcome them and help them navigate the new systems that they're understanding and having a place to navigate. So we meet now virtually every other month and do resource sharing and then have a listserv where we're able to share resources, or if we're looking for some assistance for a client, or someone has some opportunity that they want to share. For example, we've had groups that collected bus cards or grocery cards that then we're able to provide to clients, particularly when they're in that waiting period where they're not allowed to work, but they also don't have access to the social safety net that citizens would otherwise have.
And I am just putting the Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs webpage and my email address and telephone number into the chat in the event that people are interested in reaching out. If you have an immigration question or concern, are interested in being connected to one of our legal service organizations or a community-based organization that is involved in immigrant advocacy, or just want to learn more about immigration developments, my door virtually is always open. And that's what I'm here for, is to answer questions, address concerns, and be a service to the residents of the city of Minneapolis. So again, Councilmember Reich, thank you so much for inviting us to participate today. Thanks so much, Sarah, for being part of the presentation and kind of co-presenting with me.
Of course.
Are there any questions that linger per today's presentation? Do we have any in the chat, Lisa?
We do not have any in the chat that I have seen. I do, however, have another question. You have mentioned the driver's license bill and that it's been since, I think you said, the early 2000s that people could not get driver's licenses. So prior to that, they could?
That's correct. So that was one of the changes that was implemented after September 11th. And I believe the passage of the Real ID Act at the federal level. One of the after effects is that many states, Minnesota included, took away the right of individuals to have access to a driver's license if they could not demonstrate or prove valid status in the United States. And one of the points that Sarah's making, which is an important point to make, is that many people caught in the dragnet of this challenge include individuals who are transitioning from one status to another, but don't have documentation proving, that they have a current work authorization document or a valid document proving status. So quite a few challenges have resulted, and it's an issue that has long needed a solution, and for which a solution is long overdue.
Thank you.
Yep.
Any other questions?
I'm not seeing any other questions.
Super. Well, we do have some great contact information for any follow-up. This meeting was recorded, so the presentation will be distributed or available for those who seek it. I very much thank Sarah and Michelle for taking the time to share so much. It was informative to me. Some things that I knew certain things about, but other things that are more emergent. This was a really timely update in many ways. And I really want to hope that this resource, both in terms of our internal resource with Michelle and of course our partners, which include Sarah's organization, but others, that these are resources for our whole community. Shouldn't be a us, them sort of thing. This is our neighbors, or our community members, and these are resources that lift up us thereby. And so I want to make sure that this work is uplifted, it's understood, and that there's access to further inquiry or connections that can be valuable to people. And so I hope that those who were in this chat or come across it later, that become pollinators, get the word out, share this information, and make those connections, because I think that's as valuable as anything else, is that access to these resources is, in many ways, the key is the awareness of it. So, and with awareness becomes greater demand for more ability to meet these needs. That's just how policy gets generated. So it's another motivation that I had for today's platform. If there's no other comment, I will extend my thanks once again, and wish everyone a super evening.
Thank you very much. Have a good evening.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you both.